All right, so last week we ended with a bit of a challenge. Does anybody remember what that challenge was, or did anybody do it? Did anybody actually read Psalm 1? Okay, anybody find anything that you thought stood out, or let's see, I'm trying to pull up the question here. To meditate on how the author is using the Psalm, and tying it to imagery of Genesis chapter 2. Did anybody read that or have some questions or thoughts or anything? I'm going to go behind you to Miss Neff. Miss Neff, what did you find, or did you have questions or thoughts about any of it? Yeah. 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 So it used quite a bit of the imagery that you saw in Genesis chapter 1 when it came to like his creation event, and creating all of that, and using that as in not wanting to wither, not wanting to die, like the representation of death and all that. You can kind of see that there's some imagery there that he's tying on. Kayla, did you have anything particular that you wanted to add to that?
Just that it was like going back to the Garden of Eden. It was referring to the Garden of Eden.
Yeah. Yeah, so what this is doing is, this is showing that the authors of Psalms aren't just using poetic imagery. They are, but they're not just using poetic imagery just for words that sound strange to us maybe in the modern context, but they are actually using imagery that is going to in itself speak its own message. As a bit of a review, which we're going to kind of get into a little bit more, Psalm 1 says, "Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers, but his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night. He is like a tree planted by streams of water that yield fruit in season. Its leaf doesn't wither, and all that he does, he prospers." Now, if we read that, we can see that what he's saying is clearly true. He's using imagery that would speak to us, but he's also very specifically tying it back to the law, which, if you remember in the Tanakh, we talked about it last week, the law was the teachings, the first 5 books of Genesis through Deuteronomy. And so he's tying it to that, and he's speaking about, ultimately, the one who spends the time in the Word is going to be back in an Eden-esque type living situation. They're going to be blessed. Their blessings will come in that they're going to be firmly planted like a tree, like the trees that he created, like the garden imagery. So there's more to all of that, and we don't have to get into all that tonight, but I just wanted to kind of wet your whistle, for a lack of terms, in showing you that sometimes the authors are very intentionally using language that's going to speak a whole message in itself. Like, it's going to have a meaning, especially to the ancient author. That's what I want to remind you guys. That's what we're kind of trying to get in the mindset of. Unfortunately, because we live in 2022, we have a tendency to overlook a lot of what the ancient authors and ancient Israelites would have seen, ancient Jews would have seen, would have heard, that we would have missed the meanings. And just as an example, everybody has certain context to their own life. So for instance, when Lauren and I moved down here, to us, if you would have told me the word Heritage Festival, it had zero meaning to us, right? But how many in here, if I say the word Heritage Festival, suddenly you have memories, you know exactly where it's at, you know the rides that your kids or your grandkids rode, you know that you have to buy tickets early, or you're going to have to suffer the cost of the armband. There's meaning underneath Heritage Festival, and that's just by saying, 2 words. That outside of this context of Nederland and Mid-County, it means nothing. It may just, okay, Heritage Festival, cool, right? And that's what the biblical authors are doing. They will use words like Heritage Festival that have a whole wealth of meaning behind them that we may be missing. And so that's, again, just to remind you, that's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to discover the tool set that the authors are using, and then how we can begin to have those eyes to see those, to recognize those. And I started this off last week this way, and I want to start it off this week this way. I fully expect that most of this will be just super overwhelming, and that you will remember really none of it. And that's fully to be expected, and that's okay. Because what's going to happen is that as you begin to do it, it's going to become, something will stand out. You'll begin to study something, and then it'll stand out. And you'll start to dig a little deeper. And as you do it, the more and more you do it, the easier it becomes, to where now, you don't even have to know a passage. You don't even have to study a passage. If it's just read to you, you'll begin to pick out, oh, I see what the authors do. This is crazy, right? And be able to, it's not mine. Okay, I found my iPhone. We're good. So that's kind of what I wanted you to get, was that the authors are trying to speak something underneath just purely the psalm that maybe you've heard your whole life. I want to start real quick with another thing. So this right here is a family, generational quilt. Anybody in here ever make one of these or have one of these where different generations had put pieces together and they kind of tell stories? Okay, nobody in here has ever experienced that? Okay, well, my grandparents have one of these, or had one of these, and for their 75th, I think, wedding anniversary, it was a gift from most of their great-grandchildren to put together stories and meanings and purposes within each one of their family lives units. And so they would make a square. Now, just as a little different one, this is not it. This one is one that is made of all of Lauren's old track and cross-country, basically any of her running type events and races that she would run. You got this when you were a senior? Was this a senior gift kind of thing? Okay. And the reason I say this is because each and every single one of these t-shirts here, they all have a story behind them. And Lauren may look at these t-shirts and see, can recall maybe what it was like in that race, what place she got, how her team went, what the weather was like. It's going to have meaning and purpose behind it. So individually, each one of these t-shirts are going to have a story. However, as a collective, this whole thing tells a story itself. And this whole thing is going to tell the story of Lauren's cross-country and track career throughout high school and college, or just high school, right? And so looking at it as a whole, it's going to speak a whole different narrative than each individual one. And this is exactly what the biblical authors are doing. They're going to tell us from Genesis all the way to Revelation, they're going to be telling us a whole bunch of individual stories, t-shirts, here that are going to have meaning and purpose and direction and all of this stuff underneath it. But as a whole, it's also telling another story. And they are so incredible that they will link these things together. The way that I would put it is they will sew in the seams between here. And in each one of the narratives, they will use certain things to tie these stories, these seemingly two separate stories, two different races of hers that maybe took place years apart from each other. Because of the way that they're going to sew those two patterns together, they're going to connect them. And when they connect them, and once you start to see that, then you will begin to realize that they're really telling a real similar story, actually. And when you begin to see that, then you'll start to see the really cool stuff. Okay? This is when it gets fun. And so at the opening of your book, just as a reminder, is this the only one we have left now? Okay. We still have one more book if nobody has one. But as a reminder, at the opening of that book, at the beginning of the book, you'll see this kind of list here. Now this list, the guide to knowing, to connecting the squares, this is not, I'm just warning you, this isn't something you're going to find like in some textbook or anything like this. This is just trial and error with their students. This seems to be the easiest way that I can kind of communicate how these authors are sewing seams between these quilt patterns. And we'll dive into these a little deeper, but ultimately what you're trying to find is you're trying to find the hyperlinks. Now, the hyperlinks is a modern term. If anybody's ever received a PDF, maybe an email, and it has like a glowing blue link, if you click it, it maybe opens up a website or something like that. That's kind of the visual that we're getting at. So the authors are trying to input these little hyperlinks that once you begin to realize they're there and you were to click on them, they would take you back to the different individual stories. And that's when you get to find the cool stuff. The way that they're trying to, I said it this morning actually, the way that the authors are trying to wink at you like, hey, there's more here, hey, there's more here, is that list that's underneath the hyperlinks. So this would be the things like repeated words and phrases, themes or patterns, hard right turns or break-in patterns. If it's overly detailed or really, really vague in the midst of overly detailed things, or if you notice that it slows way down. Now, again, these aren't technical terms, and you don't have to even remember these, to be honest. This is just we're just wetting your whistle, okay? I don't know why I'm on that phrase tonight, but that's what we're going with, okay? When you get to see that, and you see the author is kind of winking at you, then you begin to pull the stories, the different patterns up, and we call it juxtapose together. And you're going to always see me put my hands up. I don't know why. There's a physical. I always compare my right hand and my left hand, but that's kind of what's happening. You're going to juxtapose those two things together, compare the narratives, and when you do, you'll begin to see some really, really deep, crazy connections. And when you see the connections, you'll realize, you'll begin to see what the authors are doing. Because what Hebrew authors will do is they will take the same narratives, the same events, they will craft them in a way that when you put them together and begin to read them together, you'll start to see, oh my goodness, this is like the same exact thing. These are the same stories. And not in like a general overview, man has fallen and God, the repetitive, how many of you guys have heard of the repetitive pattern in the Old Testament of like the Israelites like turn their hearts to God, but then they fall away and God does something and then they cry out to God. It's that repetitive sin nature that you can easily see throughout the Hebrew text. It's like that, but on an even more microscopic level. And what they'll do is they'll put those two narratives together and they'll say it in a way that it's the same exact story, but they'll change one detail. And that one detail is supposed to stand out. Now, if you don't know this, then when you read certain passages and certain texts in the Old Testament specifically, there's some weird stuff in there. There's some really weird stuff in there. If you come to our Joseph study in the spring, where we're really going to get into the nitty-gritty of this kind of stuff, you'll get Joseph gets sold into slavery by his brothers, a story that we've told since you were a child, right? And you're like, wow, this is crazy. But then you get this super hard right turn where Judah suddenly goes and sleeps with his daughter-in-law who's acting like a prostitute. And you're like, whoa! And then cut right back to Joseph, who's in Egypt now. Not to talk about Judah again. And you're like, what in the world just happened right now? Because that seems really like a hard right turn. What is happening? But once you begin to see what they're doing and you begin to connect these stories, it makes so much sense. Because the way that the Hebrew Scriptures, and the Scriptures alone, I say Hebrew Scriptures a lot, but the Bible itself alone, it's meant for the Psalm 1 life. That our delight is in the law of the Lord, in the Bible, and on this law, we meditate on it day and night. In other words, we have a lifetime of meditation and studying and diving into it that we will never, ever reach this end of, yeah, we got it. We got this down. Now, I know most of us in here would never admit this, but this is the attitude that we approach the Bible at. Yeah, we know these stories. We've heard them our whole life. I mean, yeah, we may not know every single detail or date or king or whatever. We got the gist of it, right? Sin, fallen nature, Jesus, we don't go to hell. One day he comes back and saves us all again. So, got it? Good. The problem is that, what fun is that? No wonder Christians don't read their Bibles. When you approach this like, yeah, we got this surface, we got it, we've got this story, you don't want to read it. which is also why we chose Jonah, because Jonah is like a story that everyone knows. It's 4 chapters, it's super short, and everybody knows it, right? You think you do. That's what's going to be fun. Okay, so how are we going to begin to recognize this? Now, this is actually what I'm about to show you here. This is actually out of textbooks. Okay, this is actually from scholars. You don't have to take my word for it. These are actually from textbooks and that kind of thing. We begin to recognize the author's techniques by asking a certain set of questions to any text that we come to. The first of which everyone knows is context. Everybody knows context is kind of important. How many know you shouldn't cherry pick verses, right? You should look at the context. Now, for most Christians, context means you should probably read at least the verse above and the verse after, right? Got the context, right? And that's true. There's going to be a lot of times where these things that we believe is true, but it's also not the full truth. Context. What does the author assume I know before I even start? And just to give away, I don't remember if it's next week or the week after, if you go back to the index there, you'll see we're not going to even touch Jonah tonight. And when we do, we're going to get one word into Jonah. when we dive into Jonah, we're going to get one word in it. And that one word is how Jonah starts. Now. Now, most of us would read that and move right along, like just assuming yeah, okay, now, got it. But what the heck is now? The author assumes now it means something to you. And so just slowing down and paying attention when the author is saying something that you should be like, wait, when? The second one is noticing these links. Now, one of the ways you can determine whether there are links or how to even determine whether these stories should be connected or not is not always the chapters and the verses. Now, the chapters and verses, they are fantastic, and the people who put that stuff together, I couldn't even imagine how they did this. It's amazing. Like, most of the time, they're amazing. But if you don't understand how the authors are ending units and changing units and shifting gears and stuff like that, it becomes confusing. Now, one of the verses I love to use whenever I'm talking to somebody who's like, yeah, we know the Bible. I'm like, really? Turn to page 1. So if you got your Bibles, turn to page 1. Turn to page 1. Page 1. What is page 1 of the Bible? Genesis chapter 1. What is this about? Genesis chapter 1. Say it out loud. Creation. Absolutely. We've heard this a million times, right? A million times. And if you read down this creation story, you see pretty simply, day 1, he creates light, or, day 2, water and sky, 3, land and plants and vegetations, 4, lights in the sky, fish and the birds on 5, 6, animals, and on the second half of it, humans, and day 7, rest. Everybody in total agreement, you've heard this since you were in Sunday school as a little kid. For the most part, right? Turn your page to page 2. Go to Genesis chapter 2. You begin to read Genesis chapter 2, starting in verse 5, and it says, when no bush of the field was yet in the land. Okay, so I want you to look at the level and order of creation there. At least what day are we on or before? Yeah, we're at least on day 3 or before. Everybody in agreement. When there's no bush in the field, right? None. 0. Right? Because God had no small plant in the field had yet sprung up. The Lord had not caused it to rain on the land. There was no man to work the ground. And a mist was going up from the land, and it watered the whole face of the ground. And the Lord God formed man out of the dust from the ground, and breathed life into his nostrils, the breath of life, and the man became a living creature. What day was man created? Okay, so are we on day 2, day 3, day 6? Think we're on day 6? It very specifically says when there was no bush in the field. And if you missed it, it says it twice. Right in a row. There's no bush in the field. There was in the land, and there wasn't even small plants in the field. There was nothing. So we're on day 3 or before, and by 2nd chapter, we got man formed before that. Okay, so has anybody confused? Yeah? Okay, yeah. Anybody ever hear this from like an atheist standpoint that are like, see? Contradictions in the Bible. That's a contradiction. I can't believe you believe that's a contradiction. How can it be day 6, 2, 3 at the same time? And a Christian who doesn't study to prove himself would say, because it's God, he can do whatever he wants, right? How many have heard of this is sort of the point many Christians will say, well, okay, this is a zoomed in narrative. This is the zoomed in portion. So we get like the order of creation, but then we're going to zoom in on a land. Anybody ever hear that? Okay, well, now you have. That tends to be what the common denominator is here. However, what I want you to see is that there are some units here. The first one, Genesis chapter 1, what's it say? Genesis chapter 1 says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Say, the heavens and the earth. Say, God created. Now, the biblical authors, the ones who compiled this and put in chapter and verse form, they do incredible jobs, but they just sort of missed it here, but that's okay. We'll forgive them. They get it right most of the time. Go to chapter 2, and I want you to read just the verse 4. These are the generations of the heavens and earth. Say, the heavens and the earth. When they were created. Say, created. In the day that the Lord God had made the earth and the heavens. So what's happened now is the Hebrew author here has now closed this chapter. He ended it the way he started it. In fact, this is something that was pointed out in our study with our students downstairs. If you read Psalm 1, I dare you to read the end of Psalm 2. You'll notice the same exact thing, because those two are supposed to be read together. So what has happened now is we read chapter 1, and then we move into chapter 2, assuming that's the start of the next chapter, and then we run into this whole like weird, okay, these days don't line up, I don't really know what to do with this, but the authors are like, thus the heavens and the earth were finished. Chapter 2, verse 1. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and then he ends it in verse 5 or verse 4 when he says, these were the generations. This was the generations, the toledot of the heavens and the earth when they were created. So now you read that with verse 1 and you realize that's a whole unit. So now moving into unit 2 now, you will get starting in verse 5. So this would be like if you were to start now chapter 2. When no bush in the field was created, he's going to form man. Now, there's a lot of confusion when you get to figuring out how the days work. My question is to you, and this is just a freebie. You can just play around with this when you're at home. He creates man on day 6 in Genesis chapter 1, and then he creates the man in chapter 2. And then he takes the man and places them into a separate region called Eden, which is not the garden. The garden is within a region called Eden. So who's man and the man? Are they different? Great question. That's just for fun, just to wet your whistle again, Let's just keep doing that, right? Were there people outside of Adam and Eve? Who was Cain afraid was going to murder him? Who did they marry when they left Eden? That's a lot of good questions, but I don't know. We could probably get into that some other time. Moving on. Understanding, going back to this, understanding when the authors are trying to end a section, start a new section, they will often do this. They will conclude a section. They will also often use little lines of poetry. Some of you may notice that in Genesis chapter 2. You'll notice there's a little 2-line poem right at the first verses there, and this is their way of pivoting into a new section, right? And you're not going to, look, I'd still read this and don't miss it, but just being aware, or miss it, but just being aware of it is going to help you when things get really confusing. The next thing, we get repeated words. This is my favorite. This is the reason that I carry with me 1,500 different highlighters and pens, and if you see my students have them with them right now, because they're nerds, and it's okay. I love it. Because what you begin to see is that when you pay attention to when the author is repeating words, and I don't mean just words, sometimes they are just straight up 3-word phrases over and over and over again. You almost don't even have to read the passage. You can look at just the words and see what the author is trying to communicate to you. Now, you should read the passage. There's amazing stuff in there. You'll miss it. But this is what the biblical authors are doing. They are repeating things significantly. It's called a lead word in a text or a group of texts, and by following these repetition, one is able to decipher or grasp a meaning of the text, and it's one of the most powerful means of conveying meaning. Now, let's be honest. I don't want you to raise your hand on this one, but I'm going to raise my hand on this one. How many of you, introspectively, have read something and you're like, yeah, okay, I am repeating words over and over, and your eyes glaze over, and you're like, okay. There's a good example of this in like the, what are they called? The so-and-so begot so-and-so, who begot so-and-so, who begot so-and-so, right? By the time you get like a half a statement in and you realize, oh, we're repeating this, your eyes glaze over and you quit listening to even yourself reading, let alone if somebody else is reading, right? This is intentional. This is actually really intentional. Because, for instance, continuing down the Genesis path, if you were to go to Genesis chapter 5, you get one of your favorite things in the whole world. You get a genealogy. This is the genealogy, the book of generations of Adam. When God created man, he made him in the likeness of God, male and female. So now we've repeated the creation event here. And then he starts going into verse 4, thus the days of Adam after he fathered Seth were 800 years, and he had other sons and daughters. How would you feel for those other sons and daughters who don't get mentioned ever? I feel bad for them. Verse 5, thus all the days that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. When Seth had lived 105 years, he fathered Enosh. Seth lived after he fathered Enosh 807 years, and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Seth were 912, and he died. When Enosh lived 90 years, he fathered Kenan. Enosh. Now, by this point, I've quit listening to myself. I know you have. Right? That's what happens. Except that the authors are trying to get you to basically do that, and then they're going to hit you. They're going to say something insane, right? They're going to break that pattern that you've monotonously heard over and over. For instance, skip down to verse 24. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. When Methuselah had lived 187 years, he fathered Lamech. And you're like, well, wait, what? Question, who's Enoch? And God did what with him? And why did they just move right along? Like, you got some questions. You want to just like, wait, slow down a second. I get the years and the people and southern. What? But this is so intentional. The authors are trying to do something to you. They're trying to go duck, 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 goose! Because you're going to catch that goose. And so repeating words and phrases is going to be really big. Genesis 1 is another one. Can anybody in here think of anything that may have been repeated in the creation event, like Genesis chapter 1? Any words, phrases? And yes, and there was evening and morning the first day, and there was evening and morning the second day, and there was evening and morning the third day, and there was evening and morning the fourth day, and there was evening and morning the fifth day, and there was evening and morning the sixth day. Now go look back and see what the seventh day says. Interesting. Break in the pattern. It's supposed to stand out. I wonder why. Okay, moving on. This is all over the place. Highlighting those words when you start to notice them, using other translations is helpful. I'm going to also show you another tool here. I'm going to go here. This is stepbible.org. This is not like the end-all, be-all of Bible study material, but it is fantastic. Between this and if you have Blue Letter Bible, those are like the two, like, these guys are people pay lots of money to get software that does this for what it does for free. So this is Blue Letter Bible. And I'm going to show you here, without hopefully giving it all away. I'm just going to go here. So I've got two events here, and it's okay if you can't read it, but these are two back-to-back narratives. This is Genesis chapter 11, which is the Tower of Babel, and you've got the call of Abram, right? Now, most people would read these two narratives separate from each other. You got the Tower of Babel, which everyone knows. What's the big result of the Tower of Babel? Languages, people, suddenly you're making anthropologists mad because you're like, see, we all came from one people, and that's how we got different races, right? And that's why we speak different languages, and that's why we're all across the earth. We got all these apologetic answers to the Tower of Babel because man tried to build some stuff, right? Now, you cut to Abram. What's happening in the call of Abram? It's not a trick question. You can just say the call of Abram. God calls Abram. He's like, Abram, I'm going to use you, right? So my question is, what's the connection between these two narratives? Anybody care to take a guess? Good. It's very late. It's okay. You begin to notice the connection when you begin to notice the repeating phrases and words. For instance, in verse 4, it says, they said, come, let us build ourselves a city, a tower with its top all the way in the heavens. Let us make a name for our... Suddenly, you see what just happened there? There's a Jewish term, slips in my mind at the moment, but it stands for when the text jumps out at you. When you suddenly go, oh, a name. How does the Tower of Babel relate to Abram now? Say name. A name. Now, how do you know that, Adam? Well, let's just look. Step Bible, if you hover over the word, you'll begin to see all the times that the name itself is repeated in both passages. This passage, we got people trying to make a name for themselves. Why? They don't want to be dispersed over the earth. They gave God the ending before they even started. We should build a tower, lest we get spread across the earth. Cut to the end of it, what happens? They get spread across the earth. This happens a lot, actually. The Israelites are constantly doing this in the Hebrew text. It's amazing. You should check that out when they just give God whatever's going to happen here. And they want to make a name for themselves. They want to make their name great. So God hilariously comes down to them and spreads them across the world because nothing will be, they can't do anything. Nothing will hold them back, basically, once they start to do that. Then we zoom into one man, Abram. Abram, I'm going to make your name great. And by making your name great, all of your descendants' names will become great. And one day, a descendant that comes from Father Abraham will come and undo Babel. Because the one whose name was lifted up pre-Babel is now going to be elevated again through Jesus, a descendant of Abraham. And so Abram is going to be the one through whom the name will become a huge blessing. Right? And so by tying these together, you'll start to see, and I've done a couple of these for you. Let me get off of this and go back here. By tying these together, you'll start to see these names will pop up all over the place, but that's not it. Because here's the thing: there are a lot of different words that you'll just read repeated, and you'll want to connect the two together. But the way that you know that the author is intentionally doing this is by how much it's connected. If I were just to say name, I could see that. Yeah, I could see that these two are connected because of the name. But as you begin to look for those repeated phrases, you'll also see he ties together land. Now, for us, you'll see, well, it says earth and land and country. The problem with the translators of our Bible, who do an incredible job, do an absolutely amazing job. But the problem is if they don't know that the authors are doing this intentionally, it gets really repetitive to say land. So they like to shake it up a little bit. They'll say land, they'll say earth, they'll say country. They'll take it in the context of the passage and they'll say a different word, but it's the exact same Hebrew word. And I'm going to tell you this is a free lesson as well. The way Hebrew works is it's built off of one 3-letter root word. There were no consonants in Hebrew when they first started, writing it down. So what would happen is, as you look at Hebrew, I'll just show you an example here. You'll notice, first of all, anybody in here, pop quiz, anybody know how Hebrew is read? Backwards, right to left. Yes, so if you're looking at Hebrew, you'll start to see, oh, this gets really confusing because they're reading these things back to right to left. But I don't know if I can zoom in here. You'll also notice, do you guys see all the little dots and stuff? These little whatever. These are the Hebrew root letters, right? And then you get these little dots. What this was is as the language began to grow and get bigger and expand out, they decided, you know what, we can't just use consonants. We're going to have to go ahead and add vowels into these things because we're going to have to differentiate, dog from cat somehow. We're going to have to do that. So what they would do is they'd go in and they'd add in, let's see, and then we'll just add a W here, something like that. They'll add in the Hebrew, right? They'll add in the vowels underneath it, and they'll do that by adding dots and dashes and all kinds of stuff. You don't need to know any of that. No big deal, right? But the problem is that the original word was not Hebrew. The original word could have meant various, five different words maybe. And whoever translated it or whoever came in and whatever scribe wrote it down is going to have to make an interpretation of it. And so they will look at the context of it and they will see that we're reading about some people who live in Egypt and who are not the Egyptians. And so they'll say Pharaoh's talking about the Hebrews here. And so they're going to make some sort of an interpretation of it. There's nothing wrong with that. But unfortunately, because of that, we don't realize the amount of words that are connected to each other. Because in English, they read completely different. In English, they may translate one word, Hebrew, that has the same root as cat. And in the context, it is a cat. But somehow the authors who are writing it are connecting this with another time that Hebrews are being mentioned. Overwhelming, I told you, fountain of information. Don't worry about it. You don't have to remember any of it, okay? You don't. I promise you. Moving on. They will also use these things that are real fun, and I just added the words so that people think I'm smart, right? They're called paranomasias, okay? What they are is they're word plays. These are just word plays. They're puns, right? All the dads who make punny dad jokes, you're going to love this. Yeah, this is right up your alley, Jim, 100%. And the way that they do that is they'll choose an English word that just seems kind of weird. They'll throw out crafty. And you're like, crafty, okay. The serpent was crafty. Does he do arts and crafts? What does that mean? Is he cunning? Some different things. But what you don't see is that just one verse before that, it says the man and his wife, they were naked. Now, how many of you are going to sit there and be like, I'm tying crafty and naked together? I don't want to know. Never mind. Just keep it to yourself. Keep it to yourself. Right? But they say, oh, these guys, the man and the woman, they're in the garden. They're happy. They're naked. They're arom, right? A-R-M in Hebrew. Now, the serpent, he is more arum. He is more arum than any other beast of the field. And you're like, okay, well, that's interesting. He's arum. Is he naked? No, he's not naked. He's crafty. He likes to be crafty, okay? Whatever that means. And then as you get to the curse of the serpent, you see that he is cursed arar. So we have man and woman are arum, and crafty is aram. Crafty is arum, and cursed is arar. Now take out the vowels, and you'll start to notice, oh, well, this is all from the same Hebrew roots, and these are clearly playing on each other. The nakedness who fall into the craftiness of the serpent ends up realizing that they are also naked, and in result, the serpent is going to be arum, cursed, more above all the livestock. And once you begin to start to see that and start to search for that, you'll just start to see the whole text will begin to light up like crazy. For instance, the whole flood narrative itself, this is way too nerdy, let this go over. The whole flood narrative itself, when it's talking about Noah, that whole chapter is just hundreds of word plays on Noah's name. Noah means to rest, to bring rest. That's why he named him. Finally, someone who will bring rest from the ground that's been cursed, right? Noah, they'll take Noah and they'll turn the word backwards. Instead of Noah, it's Hayun, right? Whatever you want to transliterate it as. And it's a totally different word, completely different. But it's playing off of all of these different words. And what I want you to see out of this is you're not going to have eyes to see all this stuff unless you really get nerdy. You're just not. And that's okay. But what I want you to see is that there's so much here that we, unfortunately in 2022, just explain away as just weird translations or old people wrote it. Less educated old people wrote it. No. These things are so incredibly rich and have depth to them and are so purposeful that you could spend an entire week talking about the word now. And so that's what we want. We want to get these eyes to see. Perhaps this is from a scholar. He says, perhaps the most famous wordplay in the story is the association between Adam and Adamah. The Hebrew word for ground or earth is Adamah. This is what you're going to see that he's formed out of. Our closest equivalent would probably be evoking a relationship between the English human and the Latin word humus, right, of the ground, like a hummus, right? And so what the authors are trying to do is out of the hummus, he created human, right? He's playing off these words because it will be out of the hummus, out of the ground, that Adam will then take food and sustenance, and he will take the chaos of a forest and order it, do God's ordering of creation into a beautiful garden, and he'll work these things. And out of the ground, he'll also bring cursing. He'll curse the ground. The blood will spatter on the ground. The ground will then out of thorns and thistles will curse the one who's from the ground. And so it's this incredibly intricate idea of playing on words, these puns. Regrettably, most English translations don't attempt to capture the etymological, there you go, association, if you want to sound smart. And we'll kind of skip past this. This whole quote is on page 12 of your workbook. You can kind of see it, but it's just more about that. So what's happening is the authors are using some really, really complex and purposeful things in their writing tool set to help get you to catch them going, hey, there's more to this. I'm winking at you. There's more to this. You should just stop. You shouldn't read naked and cursed. There's more here that's going to begin to tie in other stories. And so now you're going to get the blood of the rocks crying out in Cain's narrative. And the blood of the rocks of his brother whom he just murdered crying out is going to become a theme that you may not ever tie together of people crying out to the Lord. Think about all the time the Israelites are wandering in the wilderness and their cries come up to the Lord. It's tying these phrases back to one murdered. And from the blood that's crying out from the rocks, we're going to get one day blood sprinkled in a tabernacle and blood sprinkled on an altar. And this will be a cleansing of sorts until the one day the blood of the Father through the Son will be sprinkled on the same rocks. And so the Hebrew authors are going to tie all these little narratives together, and then Jesus is going to come and just like in the most compactful way, like just tell story after story and parable after parable, event after event, and the authors are going to do this so intentionally to tie all of these phrases together, and you're going to sit back and go, holy smokes! Like I had no idea that this had so much depth and complexity to it, and that Jesus was clearly anything but human. He was both human and utterly divine. And so the Hebrew texts are written in a way that comparing the two linked narratives, suddenly these things that seem like you could write them off like meaningless or write them off like it's a weird translation issue. Suddenly these things, or just weird stories, suddenly when compared to other narratives by using this tool set, suddenly you'll find meaning behind these things. You'll find meaning behind Judah and Tamar sleeping with each other other than, like, you shouldn't sleep with your daughter-in-law. Right? Everybody's like, yeah, you should not sleep with a prostitute or your daughter-in-law is acting like a prostitute. Everybody's like, anybody need to be told that? If so, we'll talk afterwards. Maybe I'll pray for you. Most everyone knows that, right? And you read that story in itself and you're like, that seems weird. You shouldn't do that, or you shouldn't sell your brother into slavery. Right? Everybody knows you should not, you guys agree, right? Don't sell brother in slavery. Not a sister either, okay? We'll just go all genders here. Don't sell anybody into slavery. Everybody's on board with that, right? Except that selling the brother into slavery led to food during a famine that would have killed everyone, and sleeping with Tamar led to the generations that would lead up to Jesus. So anybody really confused about morally what we're supposed to be doing here? You should be, because that's the point. If you read them in their own context, it's really difficult to be like, it's a weird and hard text, but when you begin to see that these authors are linking these things together, you start to see, oh. Why? Because they have an end goal. Their end goal, which every Christian in here, including my 5-year-old daughter, would tell you, is Jesus. Everyone agrees with that, because we're Christians and not Jewish, and that's what we're going to do, right? We see that. It's kind of the basis of all of our faith. But have any of you ever questioned why in the stinking world did Jesus come when he came? Side note, it's not because it was 0 AD. He was probably born maybe 5 years before that. So, why did Jesus come then? You see, it's because the authors have now gone from Genesis all the way to the minor prophets and told you that no matter which way you look at the story, there's no hope for us. 0. And as long as there was at least one way out, it would not necessitate God fixing the problem himself. And we had to get to that point. And so the authors aren't just telling us about these crazy events that are happening. They are. But they're doing it in such a way that we can spend an eternity studying them and doing what you just did a second ago. Oh my goodness! There's more here! And so that's what we want to get to. There, just as a side note, here's all of your connections here. There's a bunch of them. There's even more to this. This is just a quick or a quick overview. Now I'm going to show you a video, and hopefully this video will help make sense. And I've got one more slide after that, and then we're done. The way this video works is this is not an uncommon usage, right? This idea of layering, using tool sets to layer things, to tie different things together is not that uncommon. In fact, anybody who has a kid, probably under, I'm guessing, 15, over the last year has been driven crazy by the #1 soundtrack that Disney decided to come out with. And I know Disney has a taboo, whatever, just get past that for right now. How many of you guys have seen the movie Encanto? Right. Now, anybody knows me, you know I'm like a Lin-Manuel Miranda freak, unfortunately. It's just like this young man right here. And I went and saw Hamilton in Houston, however long ago that was now, several months ago. But Lin-Manuel Miranda, he composed and wrote the music for this movie Encanto. Lin-Manuel Miranda is so incredible that he can write something that you think you got it down. Until you realize that all throughout the Hamilton soundtrack, he's thrown these little tiny words and themes and melodies that are going to be character specific and somehow managed to show progression of this character from minute 1 to hour 2, all woven together in this really incredible, intricate thing. And when you start to see that, then you have to watch it again, and you'll keep hearing it and keep seeing these different values. Well, he did the same thing in a cartoon called Encanto, and a really catchy song called We Don't Talk About Bruno. You don't really need the context of this. We just don't talk about Bruno, okay? That's all you need to know. What's going to happen, though, is a bunch of family members are going to come and sing about why we don't talk about Bruno while talking about Bruno. It's an ironic song, but that's okay. Now, what I want you to see is that each and every character is going to have their own melody, and you'll hear it. It's pretty clear, right? And these characters are going to sing these melodies, and at the end of it, they're going to somehow sing all of them at the very same time. This is not a new thing. It's actually called a madrigal. If anybody has ever heard of the theater people, theater nerds know this. Madrigals. Madrigals are really popular. You'll have these, acting with Renaissance type stuff, and there'll be choirs, and they'll be singing themes and songs behind these actors kind of thing. But then they'll bring it all together, and there'll be this whole climax of everyone singing and acting, and it's just incredible. But he's going to do this with the family madrigal. Their last name is Madrigal, which is just funny. It's ironic, nerd stuff. Doesn't matter. I want you to listen to this, though. Hopefully it's loud enough. Let's see. You can hear how that's different. It's not da-da-da-da-da-da. This is totally different. Now we're going to get into a totally different one. Da, 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 da. Totally different than the other ones. Da, 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 da. Then you're going to get just totally right turn here. The music stops. It slows way down. It's beautiful and pretty, like a normal, typical Disney princess, right? She's the perfect one. You can get that just in the music. But then, at the end of it, when they're all singing, they're going to layer every single bit of this. Okay, we're moving on. Now, how many of you thought that was overwhelming? Okay, not too many. How many of you kind of locked into just one of them and you could hear the one of them real well and you know there's other stuff happening? Anybody in here do that? Yeah, I always hear the thunder. I'm sorry, move it or go on. I don't know why. Or 7 foot frame. But every single one of those are being layered in on top of each other, and it's this mass chaos of I have no idea what's happening. My brain is in overdrive, but somehow this is working. And they are completely different from each other. And it's beautiful, I would say. And that is exactly what the authors of the Bible are doing. You will get a melody that is talking somehow about the flood narrative, and it's got this whole beauty in itself, and you can find meaning behind what it's saying, and it can apply to your life, and it can change you. And then you're going to read something like, David, the first king, or the second king to come up into Israel, and somehow his life has this whole melody, and it's just this is really, I'm going to face my giants now, right? You can start to apply that to your own life. It's incredible, right? But then you're going to get, Elijah, this prophet who's going to go and he's the second person in the Bible that's just taken, Enoch and Elijah. Those guys are in good company, I guess. So you're going to get this melody that's totally different from David and definitely different from the flood narrative. But somehow it's sort of in the same song. And then you're going to get Jesus, who is going to throw all the melodies on top of each other. And it's going to be this overwhelming, just fully and utterly complex thing that's somehow working. And the scriptures are using these separate narratives similarly to the use of this polyphonic texturing, in that they are playing various melodies that are beautiful on their own, but when overlapping creates overwhelmingly textured piece of art and life-changing revelation necessitating Jesus. It's a complex statement to get. There's so much more going on to these stories you've heard your whole life. So my encouragement is this next time that you open the Bible, whenever that may be, whether you've heard it 1,000 times or it's your first time reading it, just be aware and watch how you'll start to notice things. They'll stand out. And you don't know why. Maybe you don't. Maybe you can't. You're just starting to hear a melody somehow. And it's in this song that's in the background. And you're I'm not sure how this works, but it's doing something. And that's where the cool stuff starts to happen. I'm going to pray for us. And then there's a challenge. Read Genesis chapter 1. And this time I want you to go through and I want you just to make note of or highlight repeated words and phrases. I want you to pay close attention to when you notice that this pattern is broken. Hence, I gave you one earlier. And so do that. We'll talk about it next week, what you kind of find out. But just know that it's not just giving us a chronological creation event. It may be, but it's also doing a lot more. And it's in the lot more that we get to discover that whether it's a historical, chronological thing, or whether it's a figurative thing, or whether it's a mythological thing, none of that really matters anymore, because the point wasn't whatever people have argued about for years and years and years and years in the church. All right, let me pray for us. Father God, we're so thankful for another opportunity to have a room full of adults and students who are just willing and hungry to get into your word. Father, I pray that no matter what I say, no matter what I teach, I pray that ultimately you birth the desire for them to put these things into practice, to begin to open our eyes to who you are, what you've done, and what you've done in the only way that you could. Through fallible, messed up human beings, somehow wrote an incredibly eternal, beautiful piece of art, this song that we get to hear and experience each melody on their own and get to experience the wonder of them all overlapping each other in you, like only a divine authorship could. Father, we're thankful. We just ask that you give us eyes to see. We love you in your name. Amen. Thank you guys for coming tonight. We have Yes, there's nothing next week. Have a great time off. And by the way, if you don't have my number, I know some of you, my students do this a lot, so don't feel bad about it. It's like the only thing I really nerd out on. If you have questions when you're reading the Bible or you want to talk about it, call me, text me, come up here to the church and see me. I'm happy to dive deeper into anything that you want. So, no snacks for next week. You don't have anything next week? And no, we don't, because the Dowdens are going to be providing chili for us. Yes, so thank you so much for the Dowdens and that. So.